Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to know how to get through this time and even come out ahead, then do we have the Life in the Transitions show for you. Today I'll be talking with Bruce Feiler, author of This Life column for the Sunday New York Times and of at least 6 consecutive New York Times bestseller, and the author of a mind-blowing, incredibly important, and timely new book for each and every one of us, Life in the Transitions. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, how to survive and thrive in this non-linear, flipped upside down and inside out world we're now faced with. That, plus we'll talk about titanium femur brothers, Matisse and scissors, gotcha, lupus and fabula, the wisdom of grannies, Garth Brooks and winding rivers, what on earth is a Pegasus, and what in the world what I learned in 1975 has to do with anything. So welcome back to the show, Bruce. Are you ready to shine?
I'm always happy to be with you. And I have to say, for regular viewers or listeners to this show, what you just did was incredibly impressive, which was to quote ideas and phrases and teases from across this book, including like the last pages of this book. So if anybody wonders, do you actually read the book? You actually read the book, and it's I'm excited to talk to you.
Thank you, and a mighty woohoo! So then, on that note, kind of a loaded question, but are we in the thick of a massive transition?
We're in the thick of a massive global, involuntary, collective transition. And that is a really rare thing. I mean, for almost everybody listening to this conversation, they may have never been through one as big as this. So let me take a step back and kind of talk about what those words mean and what we're actually referring to here. So I, in thinking about the story of my life, and in fact, why don't we just sort of ask everybody listening or watching to just stop for a second and listen to that story going on in your head. It's the story of who you are, where you came from, where you're going. Okay. It's the story of who you want to be, meaningful experiences in your life, the dreams that you have. Think about if today you got a call that you had to rush to the hospital. What would go through your mind? That is the story that we tell yourself. And what we know, and we've learned recently, is that story isn't just part of you in some way. It is you in a fundamental way. Life is the story that you tell yourself. So in the story that I have told myself for most of my life, I had what I now think of as a linear life. I grew up in 5 generations in Savannah, Georgia. I left there. I went to Yale. I went to Japan. I started writing letters home. You're not going to believe what happened to me when I got back home to Georgia. People said, "I loved your letters." And I was like, "Great. Have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them, and they went viral kind of in a 1980s sense of the word. So in the way I think about this now, I had what I now think of as a linear life. I discovered what I wanted to do early on in my life. I did it for no money for a while. I had some success. I got married. I had children. But then in my 40s, I had a back-to-back set of disruptive life experiences. I was really walloped by life. First, as you know, I was diagnosed with this life-threatening cancer in my left femur. I was a young dad at that time. That was the year of the recession. My family was hit very hard. And then my father, who was suffering from Parkinson's, got very depressed and tried to kill himself 6 times in 12 weeks. So this was sort of like life rearing its head and saying, no one gets a linear life. No one gets a fairy tale. And in the middle of this, we were dealing with family and medical and business, but I'm the story guy. So I started this thing with my dad where basically every Monday morning for what became years, I would send him a question about his life. Tell me about the house you grew up with, the toys you played with, how'd you become an Eagle Scout, how'd you join the Navy, how'd you meet mom? And he backed in over a number of years into writing an autobiography. It was the most powerful transformation that any of us had ever seen. And so for me, I began to think about the power of this story, back to this life story that we tell ourselves. And everybody, it turns out, when I would share this, had a version of the same story. Mm-hmm. Like my wife went to the hospital and died. My boss tried to steal money from me. My daughter tried to kill herself. Everybody was saying in one form or another that the life I'm living is not the life I expected. And so this is what prompted me to go out and collect these life stories, which became, though I didn't know it at the time, this mission to try to understand how people navigate these big life quakes, as I've come to call them, in their lives.
So it's interesting that you call it life quakes, and I think we are all experiencing a life quake right now. Before we dive into that, though, I'm fascinated about how it changed your life as you started collecting stories. And more than that, your dad, who had Parkinson's, who swore that he would never kill himself like his dad did, who had Parkinson's in your senior year of high school, I think his light went back on. He found meaning through finding his story.
And it turns out, as you know, Michael, that there's an entire kind of new academic community that's popped up. There's a whole field called narrative gerontology, right? How using storytelling late in our lives is a way to give ourselves meaning. Okay, there's narrative adolescence, right? Which is the idea that adolescents for the first time begin to tell their life story. There's narrative medicine. So this is a new field that was coming into being around the time this was going on to me. And so I went out and kind of dove into this field. And so what I did was I collected life stories. That became my mission. And I started with people that I knew, and then I became sort of somewhat more intentional about kind of hitting all ages and all walks of life, and you'll get a kick out of the story. So I was a few months into this, and my wife walks into my office late one night, and I said, Linda, I think I can get life stories from 25 states. And she said, get 50 or shut up. And she turned and she walked out of the room.
Wow.
so that became my thing. So I ended up getting, all 50 states.
And I've got to ask you, I've got one window open this because we're going to be buying an RV here coming up because we're going on the road. How did you do your trip?
Well, I did it. There was some scheduled trips, some non-trips. People came to me I did them. The internet made this easier because I did some over Zoom and Skype. And so it was every form imaginable. Like every place I went, I'd post on Facebook, I'm looking for life stories. And then eventually over time, what happened was I would say at the end of every conversation, like, who do you know who's had an interesting life story? And I mentioned it on social media, and it sort of metastasized. Yeah. And people still to this day, people are still volunteering themselves. And by the way, anybody who's hearing this story, if you've got a good life story, go to brucefeiler.com, because now I'm setting up a TV show where we're going to kind of recreate this and go even deeper. Yeah. But let's get to this question of life quakes, because you brought it up a couple of times. So yes. When I realized sort of the big idea, so I had all these interviews, hundreds of them, 6,000 pages of transcript, like it reached the shoulders of my adolescent daughters. And I then got 12 people, and we spent a year coding these stories for 57 different variables: high point, low point, turning point. And the big thing that emerged, the big idea that emerged from all this, is that the linear life is dead. The idea that we're going to have one job, one relationship, one spirituality, one source of happiness, that's just deader than it's ever been. And it's been replaced by what I'm calling in this book the nonlinear life. Our lives take all different shapes. Midlife crisis idea and the linear life was an idea that I grew up with. It turns out to be bunk, because some people have their turning points in their 40s, but some people they're born into crisis if their parents are getting divorced, or they lose a parent when they're a teenager, or they get sober when they're in their 20s, or they find new love at 60, or they start a nonprofit in their 70s. So we have these changes across our lives. But what happens is that, every 12 to 18 months, we get disrupted by something. Mm-hmm. Could be an accident, could be a new job, could be a new baby, could be getting married, could be becoming an empty nester, could be breaking a limb, whatever it might be. And most of these we get through relatively easy. But 1 in 10 of these, 3 to 5 times in our lives, becomes a huge, massive change. And this is what I call a life quake, because it's sort of higher on the Richter scale of consequences, and the aftershocks can truly last for years. And to now answer the first question that you asked me, we coded these for 2 variables. Were they voluntary or involuntary? Mm-hmm. About half and half. A half were voluntary transitions. Yeah. You decide to leave your spouse. You decide to change your job. You decide to get married or have a baby or relocate. Half are involuntary. Your spouse cheats on you. You get fired, right? Or tornado or a pandemic. But I also did them on collective or voluntary, collective or personal. Most of them are personal, happened just to us. And the smallest number was collective, involuntary life quakes. 9/11 was the one that came up the most. And as you know, there's a line in my book. It was kind of a throwaway line where I said, if I had done this in the 20th century when we had 2 world wars and depression, that number would have been higher. This is the first collective, involuntary life quake in 75 years. And for most of us, it's the first in our lives. And that's one of the things that's interesting about this moment is we're not just going through it individually, we're all going through it together.
And I think it's both. It's collective and it's involuntary, but I can't find a single person who's going through this who is not also having individual life quakes at the same time.
And that's what's interesting. If you listen to the conversations that we're all having right now, what are people saying? I'm stuck. I'm unsure. I'm scared. I'm overwhelmed. In a way, they're asking, in essence, the same thing. Am I going to be okay? Because what happens in a life quake is that we get stuck. But what happens when we get out of a life quake? What is the answer? The answer is a life transition. Life transition is the tool that takes us from stuck to getting unstuck. Because if you think back to when the pandemic first hit, we were all thinking about, am I going to be alive? Am I going to have enough food? How do I wash my hands? Should I wear a mask? And we were all just sort of thunderstruck by the awesomeness of it. The longer it has gone along, what's happened is people are beginning to realize it's going to affect their day-to-day lives. So they're asking questions like, do I have the job I want to have? Am I in the relationship, right? Do I want to spend more time with my family? Do I want to spend less time with my family? How am I going to care for my children? How am I going to protect my aging parents? Do I want to move? I mean, one of the interesting findings of these conversations I had was that 61% of people said they moved. I don't know about you, but 61% of the conversations I'm in, someone is talking about moving. So as the pandemic has gotten bigger and gone on longer, I think that the implication for each of us personally and individually has become more visceral as we're beginning to realize we're not going back. The problem with the whole idea of resilience is a spring, and it says we go back to where we were. The thing is, we're not going back. Some people may go back, but we are going to go forward or sideways or a different direction entirely. And that's where this story is going. We're now going to be in the life transition part of it. And that's where I think that I can be most useful, because by talking to these people all day who went through life transitions, I began hearing tools that were universal and that could help all of us get unstuck.
Thank you. And so I want to dive into those. And it requires, if it requires one thing, it requires a letting go of this pipe dream, this fairy tale, which really has been dead for a long time. But I mean, this was like the death knell. This is the nail in the coffin of I'll get a job, I'll get an education, I'll get a job, I'll do this, I'll do that. It's all gone. And if we can embrace that, I think it actually makes it easier for us to step forward.
No one really talks about this, Michael, but it turns out like one of the kind of big moments in this project for me, as I was doing these conversations and then writing the book that became Life is in the Transitions, was realizing that every culture kind of has a paradigmatic shape. So in the ancient world, they didn't have linear time. They felt life was a cycle, right? To every season, turn. Right? In the Middle Ages, they thought life was a staircase up to middle age and then a staircase down. And it really was not until the 20th century, with the birth of science, that we were told life is a linear arrow of progress, right? Freud with its certain stages of development, Erickson, the 8 stages of development, the 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey. These are all linear constructs. This reaches its peak with Gail Sheehy in the 70s, who writes passages that says everyone does the same thing in their 20s, everyone does the same thing in their 30s, and then everyone has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. Like, that's all bunk. I mean, it really is. I don't know if it's true then, but I know that it's not true now. One of the things that came through very clear in all these conversations was that people's lives take all different shapes. Some are lines, some are circles. Some people think their shape is a heart or a house, or they value different things. And so we have to let go of this sort of expectation that our life is like a superhero movie or a fairy tale with a hero, and they're all going to have a happy ending. There's a whole set of setbacks and reboots and rethinks and reimagining that happen on their own idiosyncratic footprint or fingerprint for every individual person.
Thank you. So let's dive into some of the keys that we can use to help get through this. And I think we are just, in a sense, we're coming to the accept it. And we got to identify our emotions so that we can be okay with, let's face it, not being okay.
So the first thing I want to say is that a transition is a choice. Like the life quake could be voluntary or involuntary, but the transition that grows out of it is voluntary. You must choose to go in. And when you go in, you think, oh my gosh, I'm the first person who's ever been here. I'm never going to get out of this. Like, woe is me. But it turns out that they have a kind of a shape themselves. And that shape involves kind of three distinct phases. There's what I call the long goodbye, where you have to say goodbye to the old you. There's this messy middle where you shed certain habits and you begin to creatively try new habits. And then the last is the new beginning, where you begin to unveil your new self and update your life story. So what you're talking about and accept it. So there's three phases. Again, you don't do them in order. Everyone has a superpower and a kryptonite, like they gravitate to the one they're best at and they bog down to the one they're slowest at. But there are tools that are kind of roughly assigned to each of these phases. So the first tool, there's 7 tools. And the first one, as you said, is to accept it. The first question that I asked in every person. So what would happen in these interviews, I would say, tell me the story of your life in 15 minutes. Imagine if I said that to you, Michael, it would take you, as happened for most people, close to an hour. And then I would say, tell me your high point, your low point, your turning point. And then eventually we would pick one transition and I'd ask like a lot of like micro questions about it. And the first was, which emotion did you struggle most with in this time of transition? And the first answer, the top 3 answers, I would have you guess, but I know you've read the book. The top 3 answers were, number 1, fear. Yeah. Am I going to be okay? Like, how am I going to survive? Will I ever work again? How will I live without this person? What happens? I'm no longer a mom. I'm an empty nester now. Or now I have a baby. Can I ever work again? Or now my kids are home in the pandemic. What am I going to do? People are afraid. The second biggest emotion they struggled with is sadness. They grieve. They liked the old person. They liked they liked being married and they're no longer married. They liked having a job and they're no longer have a job. They miss the person who has died. And then the third is they feel ashamed. They lost their job and they like the status. They don't have money. They're addicted and they don't like the fact that they've become addicted. They're embarrassed that their child has special needs. They're ashamed. And so the first thing is to identify it and then to accept it and to sort of articulate. Some people actually even go so far as to write it down. Like, this is what I'm feeling. I'm not alone. Lots of people struggle with emotions. Everybody struggles with emotions in a time of transition, but you identify this emotion. And then it turns out that what people do, and this is fascinating to me as someone who's written a lot about religion, is they use rituals, even if they're not religious, right? And like people, this is a kind of an old-fashioned kind of musty word, but they have a farewell party. They write a letter. They, go to a sweat lodge. They jump out of an airplane. They get a tattoo. They do something to kind of identify and contain that emotion, which sort of says to themselves and to the world around them that the past is indeed past and they're not coming back.
It's interesting. So between you and me, and I guess everybody who's listening, 3 weeks ago, we went through our 3rd miscarriage in a row.
Oh gosh, Michael.
And it's okay. It hurts a lot, but it's okay. It was it's liberated us. We're dangerous now because we can go anywhere and do anything because screw it. If not now, then when? And it has completely shifted us. We're all going through, in a sense, a collective miscarriage of the life we birthed has just died. And we're all saying, and if not now, then when? Now, we're going through each one of these steps, and it's not linear. You come back to grief and come back to grief, but we've grabbed drums. We put drums in our living room, and we've been going through literally ritual and shedding and going, what is serving us, what is not, and asking so many of the questions you have in the book. Because this is so poignant and important for all of us right now.
So you naturally felt that you had to do something to acknowledge that this is a painful thing, because let's be honest, going through a miscarriage is often a private thing and others may not know that you've gone through because you might not have gotten to the point of sharing with people that you thought you were going to have a baby. But in some ways, it's equally as important and good for you for bringing this emotion, fear, mourning. And by the way, each of you probably has slightly different emotions. Because sometimes the person carrying the baby might feel responsible, right? Somebody else might feel, is it the pandemic that caused this because of high stress? So good for you for saying we're going to ritualize this and acknowledges that this is a life that was lost, or that this was a moment in our lives. And a lot of what gets lost in life transition is not necessarily what you had, but what you thought you were going to have, right? So that's what you're talking about here. Not only did you mourn that it didn't work, and all the trying and pain and the effort that went into that, but now you have to mourn the fact that you thought in 6 months you were going to have a baby, and that it's the life deferred that's not going to happen. The dream that's not happening also needs to be mourned in this context.
Thank you, and that I'm gonna shift it right back to the whole group of us. But it really, this book could not have been more perfectly timed for us as a collective, and us, Jessica and myself as well. You talked about things being messy in the middle and shedding it, and we have to give up a old mindset, that old way of being, that old way of thinking. It's dead, isn't it?
So I think that this was interesting, right? I mean, I feel like I had read. I make this line in the beginning of my book where I say that 90% of the things that I uncovered, I didn't expect to uncover, and I hadn't really read about in the literature about change. And the two that we're about to talk about in the messy middle were two of them that I feel it has not really been articulated in a way that people are naturally doing. And the first is, what do we do? We've accepted our emotion. We've ritualized it. We've said goodbye. Like, let's just say even we're doing this linear, even though most people don't do linear, but you're through the long goodbye. And now you're in this messy middle. And one of it is people shed things, and they shed a lot of things that they liked. Okay? You had to shed the dream of having a baby. You had to shed. Maybe you were in the process of setting up a nursery. You have to shed things that you quite liked. Oh, I have less money to spend, so I need to not go out as much. You have to shed family dinner if you become an empty nester. You have to shed date night if you have a new baby, right? So you shed things, but a lot of people turn out to shed things that they didn't like. So maybe they shed people pleasing, if they were a people pleaser, or they shed. I talked to a woman who got divorced, went through a career change, bought a horse, and she finally shed the 60 pounds that she had been trying to shed her whole life. So people shed things that they're happy to get rid of. I mean, you just mentioned, again, I don't want to harp on your story, but you beautifully and honestly shared, you're shedding caution. You're saying, let's throw caution to the wind, because let's go out and have a last gasp of enjoying ourselves before you go back in blessedly and try again. So people shed, and that was something I don't really feel is talked about a lot, but it's really part of, again, accepting that you're not going back and preparing yourself for the creativity and the experimentation that's going to follow.
And thank you. And we've been asking ourselves and challenging ourselves. We started into it last weekend. I'm excited to do it this weekend, to look at everything in our home, look at everything in our lives and saying, what serves us, what doesn't, what is going to help us step forward, what is going to hold us back, what's heavy, what's light. And I think the lighter we get at this time, for all of us, not just for ourselves, but the easier it is for whatever pivot is coming our ways. There's an energetic cutting of cords to the old life which is gone.
Well, I like the heavy and light thing, because one of the things that I found in these conversations, and your story is another good illustration of this, one of the things that I found is that these life quakes rarely happen by themselves. That just when you break a leg, grandma needs an eye operation and your daughter wrecks the car, right? Just when you get fired, the tornado hits, or whatever it might be. And so I struggled with what to call this. And over time, I finally had this image in my mind of the old black and white movies where, kind of one car gets into a wreck and then boom, 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 all the other cars hit the car in succession. Yes. And so I realized that's what it's like. And so I call this a pileup. People have 2-car pileups, 3-car pileups, like 10-car pileups. And the consequence of that is just a heaviness. It's just an absolute overwhelming sense of I'm in quicksand and I cannot move. And I think that one of the things that shedding does, that's part of the process, is what do you do if you're stuck, if in fact you're sinking in a boat? You throw things overboard so you don't sink as fast. And so I think that that's a lot of this, is if you get rid of, if you shed some of these burdens, wait a minute, I just had a big, painful life experience. And I'm worried about this, or I'm worried about, what my mother thinks, or I'm worried about what my neighbor believes, or I'm worried. So people say that what happens is like our immune systems get weakened, and we say, okay, I just can't worry about that anymore, and so I'm going to stop being a people pleaser, and I'm going to do what I think. For example.
Woohoo! So we've gone through accept it, mark it, which we talked about, or to ritualizing, shed it, which is we're talking about. Let's talk about create it and trying new things.
I love it. I love this. It's so incredible that people naturally turn to creativity. And by the way, not creativity in the like abstract, like a fresh idea. Like, I mean, actual creativity. Like they paint, they sing, they take up. I talked to a woman who was a retired chemistry teacher in Alabama, who had extreme gastric cancer and has all sorts of eating problems. She started taking ballet, adult ballet, like in her 60s. Like people take up the ukulele, they start to keep journals. What did we see in the middle of the pandemic? What's the most common thing that we saw on social media? Baking. Like that's what the baking is. I'm going to do something with my hands because it's sort of like the act of creation allows us to create ourselves anew. So people turn to creativity. I didn't expect it. And it still, look at me, I have a smile about it. It still makes me incredibly happy.
And along those lines, I'm very, and I teach people in my coaching always to embody ourselves. I think that is so important. And you talk about Feldenkrais in here, and you had to reinvent, both of us, Titanium brothers here, had to reinvent yourself being creative. What did that look like? Because if you can share a little bit of that, when we learn how to embody, I think that's a creativity to itself.
So one day, I have these coders. Okay, graduate students, undergraduates, poets, novelists. We're sitting together all this time trying to figure out what we found. And so one day I say to them, guys, they weren't all guys, but guys, tell me something that you noticed in coding these stories that I didn't notice while I was doing them. And somebody raised his hand and he said, people move. I was like, that's interesting. I don't think I ever asked anybody that. Get out the transcript, guys. We're going to go back through every single interview, hundreds of these. And everybody went back, and sure enough, 61% of people moved in some way. They moved to a new city. They moved to a new home. They moved to a new office. I talked to a woman who started this internet phenomenon called Go Tell Your Mother. And at the end, she's like, okay, I have to repaint my office. Okay. I talked to a woman was a junior pastor, a woman who had actually died and come back to life twice in her life. And she was a junior pastor at a church in Oklahoma, and the senior pastor died. And she didn't want the job originally because she wanted to mourn, but then the church really needed her to step up and be a leader. And so she became senior pastor. And before she became senior pastor, she very smart. She said, you know what? I'm going to take a month off. I'm going to go be by myself. And I want you to paint the senior pastor's office before you move my belongings into it, because I want there to be a symbolic change. And part of this moving was exercise. People took up exercise, like swimming or losing weight or Tough Mudder or whatever it might be. And so, yes, I was diagnosed with an adult onset pediatric cancer. I had an osteosarcoma in my left femur in 2008. I went through a year of quite brutal chemotherapy and a 17-hour operation in which my surgeon removed my left femur, replaced it with titanium, took my fibula from my calf and relocated it to my thigh, actually devascularized it in my calf and revascularized it in my thigh, and then took out half my quadricep. So I was on crutches for 2 years. I was on a cane for a year after that. And I literally had to relearn to walk, which involved rethinking. Like, I'm not sure I'd ever really thought about walking. I mean, like, walking is what most distinguishes us from our ancestors, but yet it's something we take for granted. As my physical therapist said to me, I don't know if anyone ever said this to you, but my physical therapist said to me, like, every step you take is like a stumble, and then you correct and catch yourself. Like, that's a pretty great model for a life transition, right? There is the stumble and then there's the correcting yourself. And I had to redo it. And by the way, the hardest part for me was not my legs, it was my arms. I've never said this publicly before, ever, Like I worked really hard to build up the muscle in my legs. I still do it 12 years later, but I had completely disconnected my arms from my legs. So actually the act of swinging your arms, as basic as it sounds, I had to relearn it because it helped me balance myself and help me move, but it's part of walking. It's not what we think of, but it's part of walking.
I wrote a bestseller with my wife, Barefoot Running, and then went on to write Barefoot Walking, and which came out of to learn how to walk again and run again. I had to put my feet on the ground barefoot because I needed to actually feel what was going on. And when I taught people after that, I always started with the arms first. So you were onto something because the arms drive the legs.
So how is it that, by the way, most people, when I tell them that I lost my femur and to titanium, they're gobsmacked, and you're like lightweight. So how did you how did you end up with 2 femurs of titanium?
Well, I'd be one candidate for your story. I've had 2 near-death experiences. 7 years, 1 month, and 17 days apart. The first one was a skating accident, which exploded my left femur, my left hip, my left arm. And then fast forward 7 years later, I slipped in a creek crossing, hiking just outside Lake Tahoe. And I don't believe anything happens without a reason behind it. I managed to land perfectly on a pyramid-shaped rock and completely exploded my right femur, injured my right hip. And so I had, like you do an inch leg length discrepancy for 7 years. And then I'm nearly balanced now with identical.
Good thinking.
So, geez. It was fascinating. So the day after I get out of surgery the second time around, the assistant doctor who's involved in the operation, he goes, "How'd you already get the x-ray up on your website?" What the heck are you talking about? I've been laying in bed here. I've got 5 other people's blood coursing through my veins. I can't even raise my head up. Website. It turns out it was so identical of an injury that the original x-ray on the other leg faked out the doc.
Well, that's very interesting because my first meeting with my my surgeon, and he's the head of surgery at Sloan Kettering, like the person on planet Earth who ever walked who was like greatest to fix my problem. And I said to him that I broke my left femur when I was 5, as you know, and 38 years later it cancerified. And he said, "How did you break your femur?" And I said, I got hit by a car. And he said, "No, but why your femur?" And so his sort of thesis has always been that I had a genetic predisposition to have a weak femur, and that the cancer sort of magnified that, and that's why I broke that femur. And what's interesting is, you know, we may not know this in our lifetimes, but it would be curious if you had a similar kind of vulnerability in both femurs that sort of allowed it to break in the same place when you had the external pressure. But let me ask you something about this story, because now I'm going to go into life story mode. So I was saying to earlier about the emotions people struggle with, and I said that the top 3 were fear, sadness, and shame. I'm curious because one thing I had with my cancer was there was nothing I did. It happened to me. Because yours involved an accident, did you have a degree of shame, for lack of a better word, that somehow you played a part in your life quake?
That's fascinating. No, because there was this spiritual element to it, where I was given a glimpse on the other side each time, so to speak. I felt these were fateful events. Now, with that said, I do believe that the second event maybe didn't necessarily have to happen. I was, as I would say, off path or out of resonance. And I would call it universe brought me back in line. But it showed me by being identical that this was not a coincidence, not by accident. But there was a conscious choice in here. And I'm thinking back to when we lost one of our dearest pets years ago, Bam Bam, our little Japanese bobtail who we went to sell kombucha at a farmer's market while we were finding ourselves on Maui. And we came home and he had been kicked by a horse and killed. Oof. And what I thought to myself after that experience is, do not kick yourself, or there is no end to the depths you will go down to. And what I learned from both of my, quote, accidents is I needed every bit of chi, of energy, of life force if I was going to heal and make it through these transitions. And so there was a conscious choice.
Yes.
We can heal, we can grieve, we can go nuts, but we're not going to pick on ourselves.
Wow, that's beautifully said. And that that echoes the point that we were talking about earlier, that the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the transition must be voluntary. You have to, at some point, make the decision. As one of the people beautifully said that I spoke to, it's not, once the rain happens, you have to learn to dance in the rain. And I think that's a very powerful idea. And this reminds me of one of my favorite stories in the Life Story Project. It's in Life is in the Transitions, the book about this woman, Michelle Swaim, who grew up without a father. Mother was quite distant from her. She married her high school boyfriend in her early 20s. He was very charismatic, and she was sort of an incomplete person, as she describes it. And she became kind of deeply anorexic. I mean, she was down to half an apple a day. And she and her husband tried, and he was very much the kind of the dominant force in that relationship. And she was an obsessive runner. And they tried for many years to get pregnant. And as you know, it's hard to do that when you're anorexic. And one day she's running, and she slips and she falls, and she's in the hospital, and she is just wrecked by this. And her husband goes home one night, and she basically gets visited by God and says that I did this to you intentionally. The husband comes back the next morning and says, you're not going to believe I was visited by God, who said that this was a purposeful event and we need to kind of right our lives. And she gave up. She had to give up the running. She changed, and they went on to adopt 11 refugee children from all over the planet. And when I asked her the shape of her life, she said a dented minivan, because she went from the shape of her life being about her to being about the community that she's in. And this is a point I think that your story really highlights, which is, as you know, kind of one of the things that I found was that there are kind of three pillars of meaning. I call them the ABCs of meaning. The A is agency. Things we do, make, create. A B is belonging. Our relationships, our families, our neighbors, our religious institutions, our colleagues. And the C is a cause. And we all kind of have what's most important to us in second and third. And so what happens in these life quakes is that we shapeshift. We rethink and we recalibrate and we reimagine what's the most important to us. And your life is a stunning example of that. You went through these experiences and it became really a meaning-making experience. And that's the other thing to remember about a life transition is it is a meaning experience, not just a practical, how we're going to get through it, how we're going to move forward experience.
Thank you. I know this is your interview, but I'm going to share one more life story real briefly because it leads into this. Years ago, in 1993, I think it was, I'm racing bicycles in Europe, trying to make it to the Tour de France, train at the Olympic Training Center. Woohoo! I'm racing in the French Alps. I'm waved through a safety official, through a blind turn. Vous allez, American, vous allez. Oh! An elderly woman had got down an alley with her full-size Peugeot, turned onto the race course and hit me and ended my career. And in that moment, I can remember digging my fingernails into the hot pavement, and thank God I wanted to chew the pavement because I was in such pain. My left leg was at a 90-degree bend. And I thought for the next 6.5, 7 years, God is dead. There is no God. That was such a poignant, important, powerful gift of a life event. Once I had, as you described later on, as being able to kind of third person it, look about it. You call it the I think it was the tell it. Once I was able to step back from that, many years later, I suffered a lot of PTSD and a lot of a wrecked back for a long time because of the PTSD. Mind and body are connected. But when we can look at these life events and realize they're not happening to us, but if we ascribe meaning to it, we get to make that choice. They are happening for us. I believe that changes everything.
That sense of agency is powerfully important. And I think that is one of the central things that the transition does. It gives us a sense, a belief that we are an actor in our own recovery. It is incredibly important that you make it a voluntary experience, that you try something. I have this I shouldn't take this beautiful story and be a bit irreverent, but I'm going to be a bit irreverent here. And I think of life transitions a little bit like I think of the internet or I think of sex. Like everybody wants to know what everybody else is doing, but nobody wants to ask, right? So in my experience, like everybody did some of the steps that I identified naturally, But no one did all of them. And everybody wanted to get better. And I think that in this moment in time when we're all stuck, I think that people are desperate to do something to get unstuck. And I just really issue this invitation. If you come on this journey with me, and if you meet the people that I meet, these people changed me and filled me with hope. And I think that they will do the same with you, and they will give you the belief that you can get through this. And you are going to find something here that you don't do, that you want to do, and your transition is going to happen more effectively and more efficiently.
Woohoo! That brings us, whether it's in person or whether it's from reading your book, and that's a shameless plug because I want everybody to get your book, to sharing it, seeking wisdom from others, and the wisdom of grannies.
I love this story. I'm so glad you mentioned that. So I get a call a couple of years ago. My friend of mine says, "Oh, I have a friend. He's got a problem with a big media company that I had tangled in my life. There's been more than a few, even in my blessed career that I've been fortunate to enjoy." So the guy calls me up. He's English. So he says, tell me your story. I tell him my story for about, 10 minutes. He tells me his story for about 20 minutes. And at the end, he says, "Okay, thank you." And I'm like, "What do you mean? Wait a minute. I don't think I've given you any advice." He's like, "Oh, no, you were tremendously helpful." I'm like, "But, I don't think I helped you in any way." And he said, "Oh, my granny used to have a saying, right? A problem shared is a problem halved." Like, guess what? Turns out that granny's a neuroscientist, because that, people go into group therapy, right? It's the people who talk the most who think they got the most from the group. Like, I just love that little detail. Look, when my wife and I had identical twin girls 15 years ago, we thought everybody would be like, it'll be all hands on deck. Instead, it was run the other way. When I got cancer, I thought it would be run the other way, and it was all hands on deck. It was fascinating. People kind of ran toward us, which is why I created the Council of Dads. And then, as you know, wrote a book about it, and then NBC made a series about it. But what it turns out, so we need help. Okay? You can't do it alone. But what's interesting is that people turn out to have different phenotypes of what kind of help they want. Some people like comforters. "I love you, Michael. I believe in you. You'll get through it." Okay? That's a comforter. Some people like nudgers. "I love you, Michael, but maybe you should try this. Like, don't you think you should go to AA? Or like, maybe you should, go on Match.com, but that may date me. Or, maybe you should go out and apply for a job," or whatever it is. That's a nudger. Yeah. Then there's a slapper. "Okay, Michael, I love you, but get over yourself. Like, you've been telling that same sob story for 6.5 years, and I'm sorry, you've just been sitting there, eating potato chips and binging on Netflix, and you're never going to get better. And by the way, you're fat." And then other people get inspired by watching people they don't even know. Like, they find role models. Like, this was particularly true of the transgender stories, like, because they often didn't know someone who was transgender, right? Or somebody who might have grown up LGBTQ 20 years ago before more people were out. So let me just ask you, you like comforters, nudgers, slappers, or modelers?
Probably modelers. I'm going to go with modelers.
Interesting. Because why?
I don't need to be told what to do. I don't need to be pushed into anything. In fact, I can remember a physical therapist after the second one trying to get me to walk. And I'm like, "Look, I'll push myself far enough when I'm ready." They got me walking. My blood values crashed. They got scared I was going to die. So I know my body, and the comfort. There's a certain amount of sincerity that's good. And actually, I'll take the comfort from my wife. But when people come, "Oh, you poor thing." Wait a second. I'm not a poor thing. I'm going to be fine through this. But I'd love to see what other people are doing. I'd love to see how other people got through this, and to use this as an idea of, wow, he did this, she did that. That's really cool.
Well, I think that's maybe one of the reasons that you responded to life in the transition so much, because this is like the ultimate modeling tool, right? Because there's hundreds of stories. I've got examples of people who like comfort, right? I have examples of people who like nudgers. In fact, the name slapper came in the room I'm sitting in right now. I interviewed a woman named Helen who had her heart broken and, has had some weight issues in her life by her own admission. And she was going through, and she lost her parents and kind of lost a job opportunity. And she was saying that she was out there kind of just telling some story. And a friend, she said, like, slapped me like a Cher to Nicolas Cage in Moonstruck. And that's, in fact, where I invented the word slapper. She told me that story. She's like, I need a slapper. So we all need help. You can't do it alone. But don't underestimate the fact that people respond to different kinds of help, and don't assume that the help you want to give somebody is the help that they need. I mean, it's interesting. This book is, in the early stages now, but I'm finding that a lot of people are using it to help with their own life transitions. But just as many, if not more, are reading it because a loved one is going through a transition and they want to help. So if you are trying to be the co-pilot to someone that you love going through a life transition, don't assume they want the same kind of feedback that you want. If anything, you can just ask them, are you a comforter, a nudger, a slapper, or a modeler?
It's interesting with my wife and myself, we have the reverse Men Are From Mars story going on, which is, I do want at a certain time. So I guess there's time and a place for different things. When I come in and I go, wow, this took place, that took place, the other took place, I don't want her telling me what to do or how to fix it.
I'm sort of a slapper. I like slapper. I actually am a slapper myself, but I like slappers, but I do want comfort for my wife, truth be told.
Very nice. And as a coach, I say everybody should have a coach. And with my coach, sometimes she has to put a fire under my butt, which is a little bit of a slapping, going, hey, look at everything that you're teaching everybody else. We've got to turn that mirror on yourself. Speaking of turning the mirror on yourself, let's go to the last few here. Unveil yourself.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, so we've talked about, okay, what are we talking about here? We're talking about how to get through a transition. This is this toolkit that I identified that you can find in Life is in the Transitions. The 3 phases are the long goodbye, accept it, mark it. The second phase is the messy middle. You shed habits, you create new habits. This idea of the helper can go, share it can go anywhere. Now we're in the last phase. Now we're in the unveil your new self. You would think this would be easy after all the stuff you've been through. It turns out this is difficult. I interviewed this woman. I love this woman, Lisa Ludovici, and she had a 20-year career as a high-powered internet sales executive, but she also had like 3 migraines a week, every week from the time she was 3. And so one day she logs onto a conference call early. She hears her colleagues talking about how sour she is. She goes home, combs through her credit card bills, realizes she can survive for 18 months, walks in the next day, quits on the spot. Cuts her cable, stops going shopping, going out to eat. She's sitting home watching channel 500 on the analog dial, and someone's talking about being a life coach actually, and she says that's for me. And she goes to Santa Fe. She enrolls in life coach school, and on day 3, like you, she'd do it like it was the 10th day, the 10th month of the 10th year. I mean, she like you, she had the number. Her teacher walks in and says, "Why is your head on your desk?" She's like, "Oh, I'm just doing a migraine. Don't worry. Like this is part of my life." She says, "Come with me." Takes her into her office, hypnotizes her. She's never had a migraine since. Lisa Ludovici is now the country's leading medical hypnotist. And she tells me that she's incredibly confident, really commanding, just amazing person. She tells me she spends 6 months every day writing and rewriting her LinkedIn profile because she doesn't want to update it from super duper high powered ad executive to medical hypnotist because she thinks her friends will find it weird. So she's afraid to unveil her new self. And when she finally gets the courage to do it, what does she do? She finds it liberating. She's now so you would think that this is difficult, but people have to change their business card, update their LinkedIn profile, change their name, adopt a new name, undo a new name, finally tell people that they are doing X, Y, or Z. And this unveil your new self turns out to be harder than people think.
Let's go from there. Let's talking about Tell It and the story of John Murray and Winding Rivers.
So this is the last story I tell, and it's a very powerful story. John Murray writes me through my website, brucefeiler.com, that there's a typo he's found. And he says, "Thank you for being revealing." And I like that word. And so I say, "Will you share me your story?" He comes to see me. I'm in Boston with my in-laws and pours out this most amazing story. A 10-car pileup. I mean, he's had medical problems. His wife's had medical problems. His brother dies. Each of his children has a different. He's got a 10-car pileup. Everything collapses. This church he started goes under. Everybody's in the hospital. And he gets to the end of this story. And he's crying and I'm crying. And we walk out the door. And he gives me a hug. And just then my mother-in-law walks in. And he leaves. He's extremely handsome, and my mother-in-law kind of has a crush on him. And she says, "Who's that?" And I tell him the story. She says, "Oh my God, he drove an hour and a half to tell you that story. At the end, you're crying." And I said, that's the power of life stories. You can take 2 people who have no relation and give them a relationship for life. And when I ask him at the end of his conversation, what's the theme of his life, he quotes this Garth Brooks song called The River. Now, unknown to him, I spent 2 years traveling with Garth Brooks and wrote a book called Dreaming Out Loud about country music, and I know that song very well. So there's this line at the end of it. We must choose to chance the rapids and dare to dance the tide. And that's really what I've learned, is that we are going to have nonlinear lives. Things are going to happen to us that we don't expect. We think of our lives are going to be fairy tales, Michael, but the truth is, it's not the hero that makes the fairy tale. It's the wolf that makes the fairy tale. That's what you said at the outset. Lupus and Fabula, the wolf in the fairy tale. In our lives, the wolf, a dragon, an ogre, a tornado, a downsizing, a pandemic, they're going to appear. And our instinct is to say, I don't want that. But the truth is, you shouldn't turn your eyes away when the wolf appears, because that's how the heroes are made. And if there's one thing I learned while working on this book, is that we all have to be the hero of our own story. So I invite you, if you come on this journey with me and you meet these people, as I said, they filled me with hope and gave me confidence that I could get through whatever I'm going to face in my life, and it'll do it to you. We all have to be the hero of our story. And if you come on this journey, I guarantee you'll be a better teller of your own story.
Woohoo! On that note, where can people go to find your story and to find out more?
I'm at brucefeiler.com, BruceFeiler.com. This very book, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age, is available everywhere right now, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I believe it'll make your life easier. Send me an email what you think, and I'd love to hear your story too.
And I'm going to give one shameless plug, which is don't just get a copy for yourself, get a copy for everybody you know, because we are all going through this together. Thank you so, so much, Bruce. This has been phenomenal for everyone out there. This is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get Life is in the Transitions, and begin discovering your story through the transitions today, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you, my brother. If you're watching this, then you are a light worker. You're a light warrior, and I want to help. We offer everything from boot camps, mini masterclasses, full-on masterminds, and private one-on-one coaching with me. To find out more about our upcoming courses, simply visit InspireNationUniversity.com or click on the links below. And to find out more about coaching, simply visit InspireNationShow.com/coaching. We also have weekly YouTube live events with me where you can ask me your questions live, and YouTube premieres featuring me and our guests. Simply subscribe below and click on the bell icon to be notified of upcoming shows. Wow, now and again do I have one of the most personally profound interviews of my career, and that was what this amazing interview with Bruce Feiler was like today. To check out more incredible, life-transforming interviews, click here, subscribe below. Be sure to click on that bell icon to be notified of upcoming shows, YouTube premieres, and live events with me. Be sure to check out our mini masterclasses and boot camps. Click on the link below. And there's coaching as well with me. If you'd like to up-level your life, you can find out more about that in the links below as well. And above and beyond all else, shine bright. Woohoo! Thumbs up if you like this. Leave your comments below. Love you guys so, so much.